So when concerns about me and my teaching popped up, it felt big. I haven't faced that type of scrutiny in the classroom before. I'm Jill, a 7th grade teacher, and I was accused of promoting an LGBTQ plus agenda in my classroom through the books I offered students. The January 6th insurrection was kind of hard. That was during COVID, and we were teaching from home that particular day. When we came back to class the next day, I knew some students had seen what happened on TV. So I just opened up space to talk because I knew the kids were home and they had seen something that was terrifying. Students shared what they'd seen, the conversations they'd had with their parents, and one child shared that her father was supposed to be there and decided last minute not to go. You know, what do you say to that? So I just said, well, I'm glad your dad's safe. That's all I could say in that moment. We're a small rural community. We have about 400 students in our school. We are predominantly white. We've sort of been this last holdout that tends to vote blue in a sea of red, but that seems to be changing a bit. Gosh, there are some strong advocates for a very conservative way of being in our town, and that number seems to be growing. For the first 5 years at my school, I worked as a reading specialist. I supported teachers in various ways, and then I went into the 7th grade classroom because I missed teaching, reading, and writing. Now I'm working as a reading specialist again, which is what I originally came to my school to do. But in the winter of 2022, I was working as a 7th grade language arts teacher, and there was a town meeting that was primarily organized by our local Republican town committee. They brought in speakers from around the state. One speaker was a woman who was billed as a teacher, the one teacher on the docket. She had taught for 1 year in a school in the middle of our state. She cautioned the audience that you better be careful because you know they're teaching critical race theory in your schools. You need to know what's going on. You need to know what books they're teaching. And I guess at that meeting, they turned to the Republican member of our Board of Education and said, well, do you know what's going on? He was a new member and said, that's really not my role. Then another parent stood up and said, well, there's a 7th grade language arts teacher in that school and she's teaching, and went on to describe books in my classroom, saying that I was pushing books that featured LGBTQ plus protagonists and was encouraging students to become trans and gay and all of that. So again, they turned to the board member and said, do you know what books are in the classroom? And again, he had no idea. So it was just this big, untrue, blown out of proportion scare tactic to get people up in arms and to get in the school and see what's going on. The next day, I got an email with a text chain from someone talking about the meeting. My name was mentioned at that point. 3 different people who were at the meeting said they were talking about me. I was the only 7th grade language arts teacher at my school, so it was clearly me. And in fact, I do have a lot of books that feature lots of folks, and conversations do come up about different gender identification, along with lots of other things. They come up because 7th graders are curious, and they want to read those books. They want to know about people around them. And so discussions are handled respectfully, but they're not forced down anyone's throat. And children are not forced to read books that have people who identify in any sort of way. This incident started, I think, with a child's conversation at home about books being offered as choices for book clubs. I had taught this child's sibling 2 years before as their writing teacher, and the particular family had raised some questions about the book Parrotfish, which the reading teacher seemed to successfully defend to the parent. I don't know if you're familiar with that book about a trans boy. So after Parrotfish, the same family also had questions about their second child being offered Lily and Duncan as a choice for book clubs. Lily and Duncan is about a trans girl and a bipolar student who strike up this wonderful friendship. And it's a really nice story about things that can happen when a transgender youth doesn't initially have the support of their family. And at the end of the story, the father really gets behind his daughter. He was resistant to doing anything, then acknowledges and recognizes the rate of suicides amongst trans youth and decides he wants to support his child. Those two books in particular were ones that have needed conversations with students in my book talks about them, where I talk about the protagonists and plot of books. When these books first appeared as book club choices with the family's first child, the books were something of a novelty for students for inclusion in the book club choices. Well, there have always been books about a spectrum of people in class. Having some with trans children was a newer experience. I believe with the first child, the book became a topic of conversation at home, prompting the parent to question it with the then reading teacher who was sharing my room and classroom library with me that year. It appears it was still in the family's mind 2 years later when I was the second child's reading teacher. Every year, kids want to read these books. Every year, I've had a child who identifies as transgender or comes out as gay, and kids know about that, right? That's just life. Kids are much more willing to talk about their feelings of being other at that age. That seems to be the trend in my school, that kids will start to come out as trans or talk about different sexualities in 5th or 6th grade, and more so in 7th grade. I had kids during our COVID years come out in a Zoom class into our community, Parents are hearing that too. A parent could have been walking by when that was talked about. I see the kids that are in front of me that need to feel seen. And as a mother of 4 kids, that's one reason I got into middle school. I feel like that's an age that kids often don't feel safe, don't feel seen, don't feel heard. And if I'm gonna be in front of them every day, then they need to know that I see them and hear them and support them. I have a sign in my room that says, all beliefs, all creeds, all races, all genders are welcome here. I have a small pride flag in my room, as does every middle school teacher in my building. We want kids to know we're allies and that it's a safe space. So all of these things combined, perhaps, that's where it started. This one group kept continuing to reach out to various members of our Board of Ed about what I was allegedly doing. Shortly after that, we ended up having a youth summit to address social emotional needs that was sponsored by our State Department of Ed. It was challenged by this same group. They wanted to know where it fit into our curriculum and why we were doing it. I happened to be the one that was sending out the communication from my middle school team. So I was responding to all of these challenges and found out later that all of my correspondence was being fed to that Republican Board of Ed member. But the good part about that was the night before the summit, that board member called me at home, which freaked me out a little bit, but he just called to say, I have read through all of your correspondence and I can't see anything wrong with it. I think we're lucky to have you. Good luck tomorrow. So that was a happy ending. Although it still felt a little uncomfortable that it got to the point where there's all this misinformation being passed around town meetings and to Board of Ed members. I did get school administration support eventually. There was a little bit of distancing at first, and then there was something that had happened with this one particular family who had the issues with Parrotfish. They were spearheading some of this stir-up with the Board of Ed about SEL, social emotional learning, a youth summit, and emailing the vice principal. After receiving some clarification from me as the voice of our teaching team, they came back with further questions, and the vice principal's initial response was like, well, I don't know anything about that. I have nothing to do with that. I responded to the parents, copying the vice principal to point out that admin all knew and were, in fact, the ones who had supported our involvement in the summit, thereby clarifying that this wasn't something the teachers had done without the administration knowing beforehand. I went to have a conversation with him saying, like, that's not okay. You know what's going on. You sanctioned this, and you have to stand behind me. And then the vice principal turned around and agreed that admin had supported it. And it did fall within our mission to support SEL. He did eventually step up. Right now, I think our administration is worn down, like so many administrators are. I don't even fault them that much for not initially jumping to my side. I think they were just worn down, you know? I did get a lovely letter from a previous principal that retired right before I started. She wrote a letter in support of me, saying she wished she was still an administrator there so she could have gone to bat for me. And that was really nice to get. Right now, we have 3 Board of Ed members whose children I've taught in the past, which I think was helpful to me. One of those children is non-binary, and I had that child in class. I think that maybe made a difference. But I think if it had been a different Board of Ed, it might have been a different story. And even the board member who called me, you know, this Republican, a nice man who ultimately was supportive, maybe because I addressed it and I was sure about what I was doing. When he said he had read through all of my email communications and couldn't find anything wrong, it was creepy to me, but I thought, well, okay. There was power in my communication, and it did something. It was scary. And knowing what's happening in our country, oh my gosh, and what's happening in Florida, it's happening everywhere. So when concerns about me and my teaching popped up, it felt big. I haven't faced that type of scrutiny in the classroom before, although I have stood up for teachers if a parent challenged a book. At the beginning of every year, I send home a letter to parents saying, I have a number of titles, and the kids are curious, and I am not in the business of book censorship. Basically, know what your child is reading, take a look at that. And they had to sign that at the beginning of the year before I allowed anyone to check any books out of my classroom. So every parent had signed that if their child was checking something out. I used 3 anchor texts to teach standards, to have conversations for a lot of reasons. Then we would move to book clubs, and students had a lot of choice in their book club books. I created a slideshow with the book choices, links to book trailers, and so forth, so it wasn't hidden. Everybody knew what I was offering, and the kids, like I said, had choices. I do a lot of writing with my students and encourage them to write about things they care about. It's interesting what comes out, because kids will talk about things, you know, the injustices they see and the things they worry about in our world today and in our government. After George Floyd's murder, there was a lot more parents who were questioning if we were talking about current events and objecting to this. There was talk about teaching a patriot curriculum, that kind of garbage. And luckily, our administration supported teachers in that regard as well. So in my mind, I link them all together. It's kind of try one avenue, that didn't work, we're gonna try this avenue. But so far, we're okay. I think what they tried to stir up at that town meeting could have been part of a larger organization, but I don't know for sure. I'm just thinking about where it all started with that town meeting, where there were lots of people from outside our community trying to rile parents up. And I think in our town, we have enough people who don't agree with that, and it didn't take flight like it might have in another community. Either teachers didn't know this was happening or they didn't say it to me. I know there are some teachers who stopped talking to me around that time, mostly primary teachers. The middle school team up by me is supportive and all of a similar mindset. I was just carrying on, doing my job as language arts teacher, discussing issues, themes, and making connections to real life. And there was some reaction among students whose parents may have been part of the effort to limit SEL in schools and limit access to certain books. There was a contingent of students who certainly were very aware of the situation, but they kept it fairly respectful in class. You know, if I would say anything about equal rights and about treating people with respect and safe places for people, you'd see eyes darting with a couple kids. There'd be little whispers, those kinds of things. But, you know, I wasn't talking about the parents' allegations. I never said to students anything like, I know some of your parents, or I hear that people are upset. I'm sure you've heard many more terrible stories than mine because I was able to continue doing my job. I didn't pull any books off my shelf, and I didn't steer kids away from books they wanted to read. I continued to talk about all of them in a respectful way and support them when they were having something to share. I think it's really important that students are able to see people like them in books. And I also think it's really important that they read about people who are not like them, so no one is dehumanized. I think that's a crucial job of education. I think we've managed fairly well. It was upsetting to me because it happened and because it was my name that was thrown around. I hope I would have been as upset about it if it weren't my name that was being thrown around in my school. I think I would have been. But I felt like this is why I'm a teacher. And I'm not going to change what I'm doing because I think I'm doing the right thing. I had to have that moment of, can I justify what I'm doing? I can. So bring it on. I know I'm fortunate. I know I've been in this town for a long time. It's not a huge town. People know me, they know my family. They might not agree with my politics, obviously, but no one asked for me to step down or anything like that. I think our first responsibility is to the kids in front of us. I felt this when I sent my first child to school and each child after that. I felt, what a gift I was giving to the school, and I feel that families are giving teachers and schools a gift when they send their child to schools every day, all day. You know, it's a complicated web, but it does take a village. I just think about that. I think about my own kids. I think about my someday grandkids and what kind of world I want them to be in. I want them to be in a world where people are accepted and not discounted based on some superficial criteria, and where everybody's story is honored.